What's up, guys? This is Mike with All Things Fish, and thanks for tuning in today for another installment of this Let's Talk series, where I take some interesting snippets that hopefully everybody can learn from and be inspired, and cut them down into just the meat and potatoes so that you can really get down and get into the important stuff. So last time we talked about CO2 a little bit. Today you have the pleasure or misfortune, depending on how you look at it, of tuning into a conversation I had with Priscilla from Swiss Aquatics about filters and filter media. It's a pretty hot topic. There's so many options out there, but let's see, and we'll see if we can help you figure out what's the best filter and the best filter media for your situation. Stay tuned. And let's talk about filtration. It's always a hot topic. People are always asking, what filter should I get for this tank? What filter should I get for that tank? Will a sponge filter work for this? Can I run canister filters on this tank that's reef ready, so it's drilled with overflows and returns? What should I put in my filters? There's always tons of questions. There will always be tons of questions. And hopefully this live stream kind of sparks some discussion and makes you think. And hopefully you don't just take my word for gospel or Priscilla's, but hopefully it kind of puts a bug in your ear and it causes you to go out there and do some more research for yourself. I'm sure, Priscilla, at the shop, you probably get people coming in asking about filters all the time, right?
Yes. But then it always really depends on what your end goal is, what you're gonna set up.
Yeah, and that's as with a lot of things in life, there's no one answer that's going to work the best for everybody, right? So, for example, somebody may have a 400-gallon tank, and they've got, maybe there's some big Oscars, or maybe they have some of the larger cats. And for them, maybe a sump is the best option. You probably wouldn't want to run a sponge filter on a tank that large, one, because it wouldn't be terribly efficient, and the size of sponge filter that you would need would definitely detract from the aesthetics of the tank. So aesthetics definitely come into play sometimes too. But on to filtration. So like we said, there's no one best answer for everything, and we all have our preferences, and whatever works best, generally speaking, stick with what's best for you. But sometimes there are better options out there, and just because you haven't tried it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try it and see if maybe it works better. But one of the things that I see a lot is people talk about filter media, and this is kind of a big one. It's filter media, in my opinion, is an easy place to overspend money. What do you think, Priscilla? Because there's some expensive media out there. People have thrown everything in your filter media, from dollar store pop scrubbers to super fancy matrix biohome, whatever the super latest ceramic type stuff is. What's your take on it?
Yeah, so I mean, with filter media, sometimes it's really like you get what you spend kind of in return. There's really good filter media that's really expensive, but I don't think it's a necessity. You can go the cheap way as well and get similar results. But yeah, it's all about, let's say, lava rocks versus like matrix. I mean, lava rocks is much cheaper than the matrix is from Seachem, but they both give you about the same result. But then you can just get one at the fish store. The other one, you have to go out of your way to go to a different store to find it. So it's give and take.
Okay. I'll play devil's advocate with that one. I would argue that a lot of people spend too much money on filter media when they don't need to. I recently read a series of articles. Somebody set up a bunch of tanks to test the filtration capability of various medias, and I think the results confirmed what I suspected. So I don't want it to seem like there's confirmation bias, but But like you guys know, I've mentioned before, I do have my background's in cellular biology and physiology. So I kind of confirmed some of the suspicions that I had regarding surface area and different media's ability to oxidize ammonia and nitrites. And it was, to an extent, it was kind of surprising. And at the same time, like I said, it did confirm kind of my beliefs and my experiences. But more or less, what it came down to is, so we have a lot of people are pro ceramic type medias, whether it's the ceramic rings or like technically like your matrix in Biohome is kind of a ceramic type media, where it has a lot of, they claim it has a lot of surface area, and to an extent it does. However, with that in mind, it's, they like to show off almost electronic scanning microscope images of their media to show you how much surface area we have. And from a science standpoint, seeing stuff like that's pretty cool. However, from a practicality standpoint, not all that surface area is necessarily usable for bacterial colonization and ultimately biological filtration. So when you have such small surface area that even bacteria, which are hundreds of times larger than like the ammonia compound cells, ammonia compounds, like the actual chemical structure is, if the bacteria can't colonize that surface area because the surface area exists, but it's in such a small space, then that surface area is not really doing anything beneficial. Right? And furthermore, if that surface area is small, it's going to clog easy, even if you have, super fine foam or some sort of polishing type media in there before you get to that biomedia. That surface area is not doing you any good. And the results actually confirmed that. And various sponge or foam type medias, whether it's at 20, even at 20 ppI, which so foams are generally rated in terms of pores per inch or ppI. So your larger, more coarse foams are going to be like your 10s or your 20s. Your finer foams are going to get 30, 40, 50, and so on. So the medium range foams, like the 20s and 30s there, they have a great amount of surface area while still allowing water to flow through them. And so you have surface area for bacterial colonization, which is great. Well, and you have enough flow through there that the water, which carries your ammonia, your nitrates, etc., can still pass by those bacteria and offer that biological filtration. So like I said, the results were pretty interesting, and he actually quantified it. And not only did he quantify it in the study, but he related it to its ability to keep X number of fish. And he did so by measuring the ammonia produced from that fish waste using, he controlled the food. So the food, he used the same group of fish and controlled the food so that it had more or less the same bioload. And even
you should share that link so everybody in chat can read it later.
I'll see if I can find that link for you. But even a 20 ppI foam, which is, it's fairly coarse, had much more effective surface area. So surface area that could actually execute the biological filtration by being colonized by the bacteria and having water flow, so those bacteria could access the nutrients in the water. Even a 20 ppI foam had much more effective surface area and much more biological filtration capability than your matrix or your biohome. And you can obtain foams like that from, I said, various sources, where they're using the fancy, like the Porette foam from Swiss Tropicals, or some other sources that are a little bit more reasonably priced. And those results, like I said, they were particularly interesting to me and surprising. And it just kind of furthered the idea in my head that people spend, a lot of money on filter media that might not be doing them so much good. So I know
what I was gonna say is, yes, the filter media you choose is important for whatever setup you're gonna do, but I rely more on the beneficial bacteria to settle in my tank, like to be in the substrate, to be on the rock.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm trying to set up my tank so seated that I could take the filter off if I wanted to without the tank crashing. So
Yeah, and that's one of the that like I said, it kind of depends on your tank's specific setup. And so if you have, let's say if you use like a sand type substrate, a sand substrate doesn't have the it compacts a little more. So you're actually, whilst each individual piece of sand may have a high surface area, you don't have a lot of water moving through that sand. So those bacteria can't access those nutrients in the water column. Whereas if you're using like a gravel, so we can talk about under gravel filters and why they're so effective at biological filtration. That gravel has a lot of space between it, which means there's a lot of space for bacterial colonization due to the surface area, as well as that water flowing through there. So under gravel filters are actually great from a biological standpoint and their ability to oxidize ammonia and nitrite.
yeah, we run under gravel filters in most of our tanks at the store actually. And it works out great.
Yeah. And you know, under gravel filters, they, like I said, from a biological standpoint, they're great. There is some, work that's specifically associated with an under gravel filter, just because they can kind of turn into nitrate factories, because they trap that detritus, the extra food, etc., down in that substrate, and that's great because it produces a lot of microfauna for your fish to feed on, but it can build up over time and potentially become problematic.
But you know how I make sure those filters are clean? Like I usually wait till there's like the smallest amount of fish in the tank left, and then we go and stir the heck out of the gravel. And actually lift the plates up. I don't know if you guys in chat know, but under gravel filters, it's basically a giant plastic grid that's like 1/2 inch from the bottom of the glass, where the gravel sits on top of it, and there's a lift tubes, usually 2 to 4 lift tubes on it, that pull basically the water through the gravel back up through the lift tube into the tank. So the gravel is what colonizes the bacteria and the mold and everything.
Right. Yep. So that's kind of my 2 cents on just overall on filter media itself. Obviously, like we said, you're going to have different applications. I know some people like to run chemical filtration type medias, like your Purigen and related, specialty medias. Are those something that you have much experience with, or are those something that you usually recommend, or do you prefer to go about other ways of, as far as the chemical side of things, for nutrient export or removing certain compounds from your water column?
So, I mean, of course, we sell a lot of different types of filter medias at the fish store. We sell all the pads that have like the infused pads, the nitrate reducing pads, the phosphate reducing pads, the carbon pads. And then we also sell Matrix from Seachem, or what's the other one? The Marine Pure blocks, the big blocks you can put in. Carbon, of course. And for example, I had today a customer come in. He set his 75-gallon saltwater tank up 3 weeks ago, and it's still cycling. And he got turbo start everything, did everything right, and we just couldn't figure out why it's still cycling. And then it turned out that he keeps putting carbon in his sump. And I mean, carbon breaks down a lot of things, even good things, bad things. And it just, it seems like it's taking longer to cycle. So he's pulling the carbon out, and I'm sure as soon as he does, it will cycle somewhat faster.
Okay. And, I know some people still suggest it, but it seems like it's kind of more of a thing of the past. how do you feel about using activated carbon
I'm
in
not a
your
fan of it.
filters?
I'm not a fan of
Okay.
carbon at all, because the only time I use carbon is when I medicate a tank and I want to get that medicine out.
Okay.
Like,
Yeah, and I agree completely.
yeah, if it's
So,
fresh water or salt water, I usually have
yep.
those little reaction corner internal corner filters I will use and just put on a tank with pure carbon in it and just let that run. I mean, I personally
Right. Yeah.
prefer stuff like a resin, like Purigen, and that kind of stuff when it comes to filter media additives.
Okay. And I agree completely. I know a lot of people. There's different companies that actually sell cartridges that specifically fit their filters that include activated carbon, and they recommend you change those out often. And that's because the useful life of most of the activated carbon is fairly short. And I would say generally, without really doing a science type project on it, I would estimate 2 to 3 weeks of actual
Yeah,
usable effects from the carbon itself.
yeah, it's about 2 weeks, and after that, it just turns into porous filter media. I mean, which isn't wrong
Hmm.
either if you use
Right.
actual carbon. But
Yeah.
people think that it actually cleans their tank, and I always tell the people too, like, just buy a regular sponge pad, and you don't have to spend all that money
Mhm.
on buying these cartridges. Even though I'm selling those cartridges, I should be selling them. You
And and that's great that you can find. Obviously, when you run a store and when you work at a store, your job is to make money for the store, because at the end of the day, that's how you stay in business, right?
Yes.
But it's nice to hear people giving real-time practical advice, because there's a lot of products on the market that really have very little usefulness for their price, and it's kind of a money grab out there, and we can get in those a different day, but exist. I want to point out this comment from Dragon Lair quick. He said he has a drain on the bottom of his tank with the undergravel filter, so when he does a water change, he drains and it pulls some of the detritus and stuff that's under that plate out. And I think that's a pretty neat setup. I've never actually seen anybody do that. I've seen people that run like airline down the uplift tubes, so they don't have to pull up the substrate, pull up the grate to get some of that stuff out of there. But that's a pretty interesting technique. And Dragon Lair, I know you found me on Facebook the other day. If you could post some pictures of that, maybe if you're in the Get Gills group, post some pictures of that setup. That would be pretty interesting to see. I'd be curious to see exactly how that works. Terry's Tropical Tanks mentioned carbon has its uses, and the cheap freshwater carbon is junk. Try Rox 8 carbon. Stuff is awesome. Carbon does have its uses. I personally, myself, I don't run it unless I'm trying to remove something specific from the water column, and that's how I generally advise using it. Somebody mentioned Purigen and Carbon for removing tannins from water. If you don't want necessarily the black water look, or if you have some wood in your tank and you don't necessarily want that gold tint to it, Purigen and Carbon both seem to be fairly effective at doing so.
So let's talk about Purigen. I mean, Purigen is just resin, basically. And there's other companies that make similar things. Just like Chemiclean has a like green one, which is Purigen as well. Seachem has some other ones that are resin based, and the resin just will soak up things, basically. The Purigen does it too, so that's why you can recharge the Purigen if you clean it. And in the back, there's like instructions that says like put it in a pint of water with some bleach and then dechlorinate it. You can reuse it. Where you can't reuse carbon really, if it's not active anymore, it's just not active anymore. But at least the Purigen you can reuse a few times, at least 2-3 times. I've done that before. It's just the process of recharging it.
Right.
But
and Purigen. I'm sorry.
Phosphates too, like in saltwater, phosphates is a huge thing. If you have too many phosphates in the tank, you get too much algae. So where the resin comes really handy, breaking down the phosphate.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of options out there for medias like that. I personally, for the chemical filtration side of things, you guys know I love Planet Tanks. I also use saltwater macroalgae for nutrient export, not just to absorb things, but nutrient export for your planted tanks. Your planted tanks are going to uptake those nitrates for their own growth, and at the end of the day, after they grow to your desired aesthetics, you can trim those, and all those nutrients that your plants removed from your tank, you're basically, when you trim those off, you're taking those nutrients and moving them somewhere else. And a saltwater tank is the same, whether it's through a protein skimmer or macroalgae. Both methods, you're actually using something to remove those components from your tank and clean up the water a little bit.
So Tianaqua asks, is red lava rock okay to use, or is it dyed? Do you mean the red lava rock from like Home Depot or Lowe's, the one you can buy for like fire pits or landscaping or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
That's just red lava rock.
Yep.
It's porous rock. It's natural porous rock.
Yep. And I use, so I don't necessarily use lava rock in a filter of any sort. I do use it to build up my scapes under if I use like an aqua soil type, I'll throw that red lava rock in there because it's not heavy. It takes up a lot of space, and I can get the contours and stuff in the tanks. And that's, like I said, it's easy to find. It's cheap, and it seems to work well. I know a lot of people run it in their filters. It's porous. I don't run it in my filter, but it seems like some people have had success with it.
So I see Terry's Tropical Tank says, if you want to see if your water is clean, put it in a white bucket, and you see how clear it actually is. And then he also says, since I started the carbon reactor on my reef, the water is crystal. So between freshwater and saltwater filtration there's quite the differences, because saltwater is super alkaline, so it's super hard.
Mm-hmm.
And freshwater is just neutral to soft. And ammonia turns into ammonia much quicker in alkaline water. So that's why I usually use more filtration on a saltwater tank, why people usually have media reactors. They either run like resin or carbon or K1 media, whatever they prefer.
Right. And I feel like that's one thing that you see a lot more in the saltwater industry, and it's really interesting. They do a little bit more generally with their water chemistry, like running, GFO reactors, carbon reactors, etc. And I don't foresee any of that spilling over into freshwater tanks anytime soon. But some of the equipment that they use and some of the methods that they use to handle nutrient imbalances in the saltwater tanks are pretty interesting.
Yeah, like a calcium reactor is the best thing in saltwater. If you try to grow a reef that has like SPS hard corals that need a lot of calcium and magnesium, right, you run a calcium reactor.
Mm-hmm. And just real quick for those, I know it seems like most of the streams that I'm involved in lean heavily towards the freshwater side, but can you kind of fill in people that don't know or aren't familiar with calcium reactors, just what they do or how they work and why you do use one?
So most calcium reactors, it's just a big tube where you put crushed coral in, and then you blast it with CO2, which makes it dissolve calcium and magnesium, and that will release into the tank. And certain corals that have a hard base will require calcium and magnesium in order to grow. So I think that's the way to explain it.
Yeah. A friend of mine had a 210 reef, and it was largely small polyp stonies. So most of your sticks, like your acroporas and stuff. And the growth that he saw after adding a calcium reactor was just mind-boggling. Like I equate it to, I'd say it's equivalent of adding CO2 to a planted tank. Now you might not see the 10 times growth that you see in plants. But for a reef, the growth rate that you see by adding a calcium reactor is off the charts.
Yep.
So Kira asked, she said, I have too much phosphorus. Does Purigen take that out? So we're probably looking at phosphates right now.
Yes, it will. Resin will absorb Purigen. And somebody earlier was saying polyfill. I mean, that's one of my favorite filter medias to use just because it's so fine it actually polishes the water really well.
Mm-hmm. So Greg the Guppy guy asked about wet-dry setups. He says he's got 2 of them from the 80s that he used for cichlids. I owned a wet-dry setup for a short time just because I got it with a tank that I bought. I never set it up. It's basically a sump that has a trickle feature through it. They seem to they work just fine. I don't personally have a ton of experience, like I said. They're being phased out just because there are better options out there. I think the advantage of a wet dry setup, and you might see it in some of the fish farms. I know they use like a pool filter sand, like a sands type filter, as well as a wet dry. You do get the extra oxygenation from the wet dry that's definitely beneficial.
I don't like wet dry filters. I don't like anything that trickles like that.
Just noisy. Yes. S asked, when is it ever practical for a sump system? A sump system is a great option for, I generally think, if you're going to spend, there's a price point for it. And I personally think that price point is generally about 75 gallons. Once you go bigger than 75 gallons, you can set up a sump that will be cheaper, far more effective, easier to work on, and offer a lot more flexibility than something like a canister. Now, a sump can be daunting because you may either go with a hang-on back overflow, which has the potential to break siphon and flood your floor, or you're looking at drilling a tank. Now, reef-ready tanks, which are already drilled, so they're drilled for generally a drain line going to the sump and a return line to return that water back to your display tank, are becoming more common these days. But the advantage of a sump, like I said, they're a lot easier to work on. You can work on it while the tank's running. You don't have to open up that canister and deal with tearing a canister apart. You can fit whatever media you want in it. You can hide as much equipment as you need to, whether that's a carbon reactor. If you're running CO2, you can plumb that in there. Let's not flood our floors. You can keep your heaters down in there. You can swap out whatever media. Some people set up like refugiums. Like if you have let's say a 125 and you have Mbuna cichlids in there, so they don't play nice with plants, you can keep plants in your sump to control like your nitrates and your phosphates. So that's definitely an advantage to the sump. I bring up the price point because a sump, you're adding water volume, you're increasing the likelihood of having more stable water by increasing the water volume. You'll see salty guys run huge sumps. They may have a 75-gallon display, but they'll run a 150-gallon sump because they can fit a lot of live rock in there, which increases your biological filtration capability, and it increases the water volume, which will ideally increase the stability because it takes a lot more to cause a swing in your water parameters.
So one thing to Geek Boy's comment, but flooded floors are so much fun. Like a lot of people think that if they're gonna get a sump, they're gonna flood their house, which is not true at all, because you just have to pick the right sump and make sure the sump will hold the excess water for the case your pump will turn off. And there's a way you can calculate that, and you can test it. I mean, you can plug out the pump and see how far the sump is gonna go up. And if it's going to overflow, then you have to adjust your overflow or your water level. So it's kind of
like you said, I think that scares a lot of people. But if you do, it's not a super complex concept to wrap your mind around. It's not super hard to learn about. There's a lot of information out there about designing your own overflows and running a sump. And I think it used to maybe be a little bit difficult when we didn't have DC pumps to control flow rates. But now that you have a DC pump, you can crank that bad boy up or turn it down and achieve whatever you want running if they flooded it.
And I mean, the reason why people like sumps is because you can put much more filter media in there.
It gives you way more room.
Volume, yeah.
And dollar for dollar. So a lot of people, once you start getting into big tanks like a 125 or a 180, I see, people mention like an FX6. An FX6, unless you get it for a great sale price, is super expensive. A sump that will offer you, so you can set up so if you're running, we'll say a 180. So you could run a 20 long or a 40 breeder. You can get both of them for about the same price. It can be used. You don't need a brand new tank. You can get a return pump for a decent price, put whatever media you want in it, and glue in some silicone in some baffles real quick. You can have a sump that will outperform an FX6 any day of the week for less money.
Yeah, I don't sell that product, and I don't want to talk about it.
Dave asked if you can keep more fish in your sump. Definitely. So if you have fish that spawn in your main display tank, you can remove the fish and you can place those in your sump, and those fry can grow out there where they're in the exact same water parameters. Or you can keep shrimp in your sump, and you can get into, you see it a lot more with saltwater people, but like a refugium type setup.
Yep. Oh, speaking of sump, I built a sump out of a 29-gallon myself for my 125 freshwater tank, and I'm gonna plant the whole thing, and I'm gonna put the CO2 into the return line of the sump. Instead of having the equipment in the tank, it's gonna be in the sump. Same goes for the heater. So a lot of the time it's looks, especially in saltwater, you use all that extra equipment like a skimmer, a reactor, a heater, everything. All that stuff you can put in a sump instead of having it in your tank.
And I know a lot of people, like planted folks, ask, well, aren't you off-gassing a ton of CO2 running a sump? And I would say, generally speaking, no. You're not going to use, you may use a little extra that off-gasses, but the amount is negligible. I sure wouldn't not run CO2 or not run a sump just because of the idea.
Right. And a lot of people do actually breed stuff in their sumps. In saltwater, it's a lot of people actually put a light on there, and it's called a refugium, where you grow algae in there. In freshwater, you can do the same thing. You could put Java moss in your sump, and it will create all this excess nutrients your tank's creating. So it's kind of a win-win situation if you have a sump set up the right way.
Right, and that's a great idea. And I think a lot of people are just afraid of sumps just because you don't see them often. You can't it's less often to just go buy a sump setup. Sometimes you have to do a little design work in it and put it together yourself. But the options, a sump offers you so many more options. Like you said, you can put moss in a sump and suck up some of your nitrates and phosphates. That way you can put shrimp down in there in the sump. And like I said, you can customize it to fit whatever your needs are. And that's a great benefit. Bottom Dwellers asked about all-in-one systems. He said he might get one if he does salt, if he ever does a salt tank. Do you guys sell a lot of all-in-ones, like the BioCubes?
Yes.
Or those types of setups? You do?
I'm selling 20-gallon JBJ all-in-ones all day long, every day.
Okay.
It's an easy tank. It's pretty inexpensive, too. It's like $179. It's a tank, the filtration, and the mat. It's rimless, and it basically overflows, goes down underneath the baffle into the filter media, back to the return chamber, where there's a little pump pushing it back into the tank. So it's basically a sump behind the tank.
And it seems like they're gaining popularity. They look clean, generally speaking. You don't have the equipment hanging off the back of the tank. You don't have so many cords. A lot of them, like the BioCubes, are more of like a lidded setup where it has the lid on it, whereas the JBJ is a rimless setup where you'd use like a clip-on light or you'd suspend a light over it, right?
Yeah, and I mean, they make even up to like 100 gallons all-in-ones if you really want to like go big or whatever. Like one of the really popular size too is the 65-gallon JBJ all-in-one. It's a 3-foot tank. It's like a 40 breeder almost, just a little bit taller.
Okay. Yeah. Kira said she made a refugium without even knowing what it was. It was all plants with water running through it. Yeah, and a lot of people experiment. A sump doesn't always have to be below the tank. There's some people that set up overhead sumps. So there's a lot of options out there. I would recommend do your research. Ask somebody that's familiar. Most local shops have somebody that knows a lot about setting up sumps. And if you have like a reef group near you or a saltwater group, saltwater guys set up and build sumps and design overflows all the time. They're a great resource. Like I said, I think they're undervalued and underseen in the freshwater side of things.
But my personal favorite filter is a sponge filter because I like to keep shrimp and I like them to not get sucked into any mechanical filtration. Just me.
Yeah. And we got into kind of some of the nerdy filtration stuff. I know you mentioned your personal favorite filter is a sponge filter, and that kind of goes back. I mentioned that I think a lot of people overpay for filter media by going with some of the ceramic media that's available just because of the marketing hype behind it. If you look at a lot of the large breeding rooms where people keep a ton of fish in small tanks, yes, they're doing water changes often, but they're all running sponge filters. I mean, you kind of think they're onto something, not just because it's cheap, but because it's effective enough to handle the bio load of having an excessive, well, borderline excessive amount of fish in a fairly small tank for what they are.
I think it's more the convenience if you have multiple tank syndrome. I mean, just imagine, I got like 50-something tanks. If I would have, I love hang-on back filters. I really do. I mean, I got 2 running back there. I don't know if you can hear them, but they're actually super trickly. If I would have 50 hang-on back filters, I mean, that would be a little toll on my power bill, or just on the power in general.
Yeah, and that's definitely a factor when you consider your filtration selection. Is how much is it going to cost to run this long term? Something like a sponge filter, in itself, you're going to pay maybe $10 for the filter, and then an air pump, depending on what air pump you decide to go with, can run it and last a long time with no maintenance. That sponge isn't very likely to break down. The plastic components aren't very likely to break. Whereas something like a canister filter, I've had a variety of canister filters over the years, and the amount of impellers that I've replaced is, not a good thought to think about. Yeah. And that happens for a variety of reasons. And they're just finding the parts isn't super cheap.
And the maintenance on it too. There's certain filters, canister filters. Every time I know I have to clean them, I'm like throwing a fit. Yeah. I'm trying to find somebody else that's gonna clean that filter.
Right. And I know most of the designs are. It's like if you look at the APIs, or well, I guess the Reina series, they were the Phil Stars for a while, but and the Aqua Tops, I know for sure. It's a top loading design, so you have to disconnect it, take the whole thing somewhere where you can clean it, dump it out, change out, like rinse each basket as required, do what you need to do. And it can become a chore. I can do a water change on 25 tanks in less than an hour, but as soon as I have to clean a canister filter out, it turns into a big job for me. Yeah. It's not something I want to deal with. Some people are like, oh, I don't mind. And that's an advantage of hang-on back filters, is they're generally pretty cheap. They're usually fairly effective. Some of them offer a lot of media room, and it's super easy to change. You can leave the canister filter on the tank, you pick up your basket of media, or you pull individual media out, and you rinse it, you do whatever you need to do, and you're on your way.
Yeah, but I mean, if I would set up just a single tank for a community tank, and I would want it to look nice, like besides having multiple tanks, I probably would go with either a hang-on back filter or a sump, actually.
Okay. Over a canister?
Yes, but before I would do a canister. And there's certain canister filters I wouldn't even use if I would get them for free.
Okay.
Just because they're hard to clean. Yeah.
Kira said she likes to use plastic scrubbies and sponge. I know you mentioned you like to use polyfill. It's all cheap. I just think, obviously most of us don't have an endless budget. I think for the money, generally speaking, your money is better spent elsewhere. And the numbers show, I'll link that article in the description. The numbers show that some of the cheaper medias are, a lot more effective from a biological standpoint compared to some of the expensive ones like your Matrix, your BioHome. And then I kind of briefly mentioned mechanical filtration. Your foam types, your pot scrubbers, not only do they offer the biological based on the surface area, but they offer a great amount of mechanical filtration where your matrix, your biohome, your lava rock, your ceramic rings, those generally aren't going to offer the mechanical side of things. So why not kill two birds with one stone? A lot of like if you're running a canister, if you're running a hang on back, you have limited space as to how much media you can fit up in there.
Jeffrey Watt says Oase Biomaster is the best canister I've used, but then again, it's the only one I've used. I know that filter is really good, and if I would use a canister filter, I probably would use actually that one, but I feel like it's a little bit too expensive for a canister filter. Because it's like it takes a heater too. You can put a heater in the canister filter.
And I know like some of the canister filters have heaters in them now, like the Oase. Some of them have, like Aquatop offers some models with a UV sterilizer. So they are making changes, and they're getting better where they allow you to hide some more equipment in them. Again, I think the maintenance is still kind of a pain, and they can be expensive. I haven't personally used an Oase. It seems like I hadn't heard of Oase until like George Farmer started using them a little bit more on his setups, I think.
Yeah. No, I heard
seems like it's a little more of a European thing.
I've never used it, but I mean, it sounds like it's a great filter.
Yeah, it does sound like it's super high quality, and it just depends on what you'd like to do. Dragon Layer said he's always done underground filters and hang-on backs, but I'm now doing a sponge filter with a few hang-on backs. He bought a linear piston pump. Got to get my money's worth. Linear piston pumps running sponge filters are great. Even if you don't have a ton of sponge filters, a linear piston pump offers you, reliability, and it doesn't. If you look at the power usage for a linear piston compared to running several smaller diaphragm pumps, you're saving money there for sure.
Yeah. So Patty also asked, could you use UV sterilizers just sometimes? If you don't have a reason to run a UV sterilizer 24/7, though.
I agree. So you can use it sometimes. It's one of those things that's nice to have on hand. I've personally found that a UV sterilizer is an easy fix for green water whenever you encounter green water, or if you have some sort of pathogen, like if you have ick, it'll help remove some of it while it's free floating in the water column. But you don't have to run it all the time.
So actually, let me correct this. If you have a pond, a UV sterilizer is great, so your pond stays clear. Run it 24/7. If you have a saltwater tank with a lot of expensive fish, run the UV sterilizer 24/7 because it's kind of a fail-safe. Because in saltwater, if you get ick or any weird parasite, they might all die within 24 hours. So you better let your UV run. But in a regular freshwater tank where you don't overstock it, don't have issues, there's no...
Patty, on UV sterilizers, Patty said she wants to keep the tank disinfected to kill disease.
I mean, if you have a tank where you don't put fish in there that are not quarantined on a regular basis, and your fish are healthy, then you don't really have any disease coming up anytime soon. Does that make sense?
Right. She asked if she could kill columnaris if she used it regularly. Would it reduce the odds of having a columnaris problem?
I mean, of course, it would reduce the odds, but then also the question is, what kind of UV sterilizer are you going to use? I mean, there's different wattages, different pressure going through UVs, different... Like, if you buy a cheap 3-watt UV sterilizer and you put that in, like, your canister filter inline, if you get disease, you're going to get disease. I don't think it's going to actually kill things. And then I would say spend $400 on a really good UV sterilizer that probably will keep your water cleaner than a hospital. Right.
And I'd say so UV sterilizers could potentially have their drawbacks. From a micro critter point of view, you have a lot of pods and little things running around your tank that you might not necessarily see or see as a benefit, but they are highly beneficial both for, as a tank matures. One of the benefits is that you get a lot of microfauna running around in your tank to help break down detritus, to feed your fish, etc. If you run a UV sterilizer, those critters can run through that UV sterilizer and get nuked pretty easily as well. So just something to think about. Like I said, might be knowledgeable. He's got a lot of stories. So now we initially started about talking about filtration, right? And we sidetracked to medication. So you medicated your fish. What potential harm do some of those medications have on your filtration? And what would you do to remove those medications once you're through with them?
That's a long answer. Any gram-negative medication will kill some of your beneficial bacteria. Like Metro will kill some of your beneficial bacteria. So not every bacterial medicine will kill your beneficial bacteria, but I mean, take it into consideration, it could somewhat harm it. And then also, when you do use medication, back to filtration, don't use carbon at the same time. Otherwise, as soon as that medication passes through that active carbon, there's no more medication because it's breaking it down.
Okay. So great points there. Yeah, you have to be careful, like you said. So some medications will nuke your filter media, and to remove them, activated carbon's a good option to remove them. So make sure you don't have any in your filter when you're dosing. Otherwise, you're just kind of, you're wasting your money and you're not actually executing a successful treatment of your fish, because that's just going to remove the meds as soon as it hits that filter media.
Yeah, but I feel like the medication that actually will attack your beneficial bacteria, it's if you dose it accordingly to what it says on the package, you're not going to add enough medication to crash your cycle if you have a well-established tank.
Okay. Rocco's Fish Room, you could use carbon to remove medications as well. Yeah, sure thing. And we talked about filters and filter media, and we talked about using substrate. You're colonizing that substrate, whatever it may be, with some sense of beneficial bacteria. But we didn't really talk about either rock, so either live rock in a salt tank, or maybe you have holy rock if you run a cichlid tank, or plants. So your hardscape planted tanks, obviously, plant leaf surfaces have a ton of surface area. So while it's not necessarily a filter or filter media, you can run a tank biologically just by having a lot of plant mass due to all that surface area for your beneficial bacteria. And generally, there's pretty good flow over those leaves. So that's something to consider. And like I said, you see that on the salty side. A lot of saltwater people, all their biological filtration is through the use of rock. Generally, your live rock and your dry rock is pretty porous, has high surface area. So that's something to consider as well.
So rock, you answered Rocco's question, right?
Mm-hmm.
He had another question. Have you used ChemiPure Green or ChemiPure Blue? I like ChemiPure Green because it's mainly resin. The ChemiPure Blue is mainly carbon. So same thing. I mean, resin won't take out all the good stuff, where carbon just breaks down everything.
A pain in general. Jeffrey Watts, all things fish. So will carbon-infused filter sponges remove meds? Yes, I would say so. As long as there's fairly fresh activated carbon, whether it's embedded in some other type of media, or if it's loose in like a media bag, I believe it would.
I mean, again, carbon's only active for about 2 weeks. So after that, it's just filter media, porous filter media.
So Scott's Aquatics commented, and this is a topic that I see come up on occasion, not super often. And he said, if you have a planted tank, you shouldn't be using carbon in your filter because it just pulls the fertilizer out of the water. Yeah. So I will, in the comments below the description of this video, I'm going to go find a link when we're done here. And there's actually a study done on exactly what compounds carbon removes from the water. And the research data shows that the compounds that activated carbon will remove from the water are not anything that we dose. Okay, so at best it's a very extremely completely negligible, very small amount of iron. So it's not pulling your potassium nitrate out of the water for your nitrates. It's not pulling your phosphates out of the water. So your macros and micros, that activated carbon's not pulling any of those out of the water. So you can dose just fine that carbon's not going to remove.
Yeah, there's filter media that's made to pull out phosphates, which is usually green, and then the carbon's usually black, and then anything nitrate removing is usually gray.
Okay. But yeah, I see, and nothing against you, Scott, nothing at all. But I've seen the research for it. I see that question come up a lot. I've talked to a lot of folks, Kevin Grant, Tom Barr, Dennis Wong. I've spoke with them several times about different, water chemistry situations and what does and doesn't pull our micro and macronutrients out of the water, and activated carbon has little to no effect. Later we'll support that.
I've tried a lot of things, and it's really depending on your setup. If you do a cichlid tank, hard water, no plants versus a planted tank versus a large tank versus a small tank, the filtration is different.
Right. And if it's not broken, don't fix it. I'd always encourage you to try something new. There may be a better way out there. There may be something that works better for you. You may try it and find out that it works worse for you. The majority of what I say, I try to make it clear, whether that's my experience or my opinions, or if it's something that I can actually back up with some data.
And just because something doesn't work out, don't give up. There's another solution.
Right. Yeah. There's always workaround. You may do. So Tom Barr might tell you something, right? And I would, generally speaking, take Tom's advice on planet tanks, but he might tell you to try a technique that doesn't work. So you try maybe a technique that Dennis Wong suggests, and Dennis works. So there's always, you can't predict every variable, and there's no best answer for every situation. Like I said, just with filters, do what works for you. If you find something that works, stick with it. Dragon Layer, I talked to you the other day. I know you said you'd run a bunch of undergravel filters. That works for you. You had success. Stick with it. The only thing I ask, and I try to hold myself to the same standard, is that when you give advice or give somebody an opinion or information, make it clear whether this works for me, this may not work for you. Don't say this is the answer or this is a fact if it's something that could be open-ended.
Yeah, but then there's also certain things that are scientifically proven to work out.
Right. So anything that you can support with evidence, please do. And I'll try to do the same. Like I said, I talked about the carbon not removing your micros and macros. I'll go find that study and I'll post that study below. And the article that I kind of touched on earlier, talking about filter media, I'll go find that study, and that'll definitely be down in the comments so that you guys can check that out. Maybe I misinterpret it. Maybe the study, maybe you look at it and you find a flaw in the study, but I encourage you to go out there. YouTube's nice because it's easy to listen to stuff. You don't have to do so much work. You can work on your tanks while you listen, but there's a lot of reading out there. There's a lot of books. There's a lot of scientific articles. Check those out. And hopefully we can inspire you guys, whether we say something and you're like, I'm not sure if that's right, and that inspires you to go find evidence to prove that I'm wrong. I will gladly read anything. If you guys want to send me an article or a book or something, I will gladly read it and take a look at it, because I'm always trying to improve myself as well. So I'm here because I'd like to help you guys, but at the same time, I'm here to learn for myself, and I've learned a lot. I've only been around actively on YouTube, I guess, for a month or so, but I've learned a lot from you guys.
All right, guys, there you go. There's a quick little discussion about filters and various filter medias and how they may or may not apply to your tank and your goals. Let me know down in the comments below what's your preferred filter and why. What's your preferred filter media and why to use it? Do you prefer some of the expansive ceramics or super porous medias, or do you like to keep it cheap with pot scrubbers or something simple? So thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed the video, hit the thumbs up. If you didn't, hit the thumbs down and let me know why. If you're not already subscribed, hit the subscribe buttons to stay tuned for the newest content and continue along with this little ride with me. But that's it for now. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day.